Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to 2020 and our first webinar for 2021, sorry, and our first webinar for the year. Hard to believe we're already kicking off the year and right into it, but it certainly started off with a bang and should be another interesting year ahead. Now, one of the things that's happening a lot around the industry is advisors, through their own choice or through corporate activity and what have you, are having to reassess about their licensing arrangements and either change licensees, either because they're being forced to move or they're choosing to move. There's a lot of activity, and certainly one of the considerations that often comes to mind is at this time is whether to get them to go self-licensed. So last week, my colleague Monique and Sue did a session on what to look at and think about when looking at licensees. So today we're going to be talking about what to consider and what are the issues of import, if you like, to think about when you're looking at going self-licensed. Certainly not an exhaustive view of the pros and cons, but certainly enough to get you thinking about whether it is an option for you and what to go through. And obviously for those of you who are new to Elixir, and I'm part of a team. My name's Graham Bernard. I'm the Sydney-based consultant for Elixir. And supported by colleagues around the country. Sue Viskovich, who I'm sure many, and if not all of you know well, is based in Perth and started up Elixir well over a decade ago, 12, 13 years ago. And Lana Clark has been based in Brisbane with Sue for a long time. And then I've been on board for a couple of years. And we've recently been joined also in Perth by Monique LaRue, who, as you can see, we have been in lockdown since she joined, so haven't had a chance to get together and get our photo all in one place. Elixir do a range of business coaching and support across the financial advice business, dealing with small and large practices, large licensees, self-licensed businesses with a whole range of business issues. And in particular, known for pricing research and every couple of years doing a deep dive into pricing in the industry, but also through our Evolve Alliance, there's a myriad of other support collateral touching on a range of different areas of the business. So we do think we have a lot of experience talking to all sorts of businesses that have gone through and either are self-licensed or have gone through the process of getting it and have learned a lot along the way. Now, I'm fortunate to say I'm joined today by Sean Graham from Assured Support. Again, I'm sure many of you know Sean, and tremendous amount of experience and expertise in compliance support, both in terms of getting people licensed and then also providing guidance. So Sean, I'll get you to introduce yourself and explain a little bit about what Assured Support do.
Yeah, hi, my name's Sean Graham. Assured Support looks after roughly about 120 AFSLs across Australia, from large entities to quite small businesses. We also helped a lot of those businesses get their own license. And really, getting a license is the first step. It's keeping your license, which is important, and being able to maintain it and run a sustainable business, which is what we're going to talk about today as well. We also do a lot of advisor reviews, and I think we're up to about 11,000 plus advisor audits since we started the business. And when we do the reviews, same as when we do licensee reviews, we're always data driven. So we'll always refer to that data to help benchmark you against the industry and to help you understand where you sit and what the regulatory expectations are as well.
Yeah, terrific. And of course, just from a logistical perspective, if you've got any questions along the way, please just put them in the Q&A box. We'll try and get them through the course of the session. We do have quite a bit of information to cover, so it might be a bit tight. And if not, we'll just respond as best possible afterwards with any questions we haven't answered during the course of the session. So, like I said, one of the key things that people are thinking about is going self-license the right move, and we're certainly not here to say that it's always the right move. There's some people that are very well suited, and in fact, much better off being within a licensee with all the infrastructure and support around that. And a bit of what we'll touch on today is kind of what's involved in running a license, so to get you thinking about kind of the impacts on your day-to-day business. But it is something that, if you are at that point of inflection where you're needing to change, it's certainly something to put on the table as one of the options, because there's probably some myths and misconceptions around being self-licensed we'll cover off today that may make it seem easier than what you thought, or maybe it might even end up seeming more onerous than what you thought. But I guess where to start when thinking about it as an option? Well, when we do our business coaching at Elixir, we cover off 16 different elements of the business, all of which are important. And certainly as you go through this process of securing and then implementing a license, all of these will come into play at some time or other. So they're all important. But we always start with someone talking about their vision and purpose, purpose being kind of why you got into advice and why you're doing and how you want to benefit clients. But importantly, the vision, being really clear about where you're wanting to head, because that can have a big impact on decisions around going self-licensed. So be very clear, not just what your business is today, but where you want it to be 3 to 5 years from now. So what sort of scale, how many advisors, how many locations, and certainly if you did get a license, do you envisage licensing other advisors either directly in your business, or could you end up licensing advisors outside your day-to-day control, which can really impact the types of activities you need to be implementing to run the business, compared to if it was just you running your own office as a sole advisor. It can be quite a different process. So I think being really clear in your mind about that. So certainly then when you talk to Sean, from a compliance perspective, or people like myself about some of the business impacts, it's much easier then to assess what the right call should be and how to implement that correctly in your business. The other thing is to try and be really clear and take a bit of the emotion out of it about what do you like and dislike about your current licensee, and in fact, what do you like about being an authorised rep or don't like? What are those things that are causing frustration, or what are those things that you think you would miss if you left? And then be really clear, how would this change if you are self-licensed? Because there are some things in our industry that, like it or not, they're not going to change. The licensee requirements are just, in fact, implementing the law. But there might be some things where certain licensees go beyond ASIC requirements. You might be able to do things a bit differently. So I think finding those pain points and then analysing, and if need be, talking to someone like Sean, about how would that change if I left? So you're really clear about the pros and cons and the benefits, and importantly, the impacts on you. But I guess, one of the things I hear a lot, and Sean, you're probably the same, is there's a lot of concerns or questions or things people say about getting self-licensed. So I'd like to just unpack those a little bit and maybe explore these and see if there's any truth or not about some of these things. So first of all, Sean, what's involved? I hear often that it's a really lengthy, time-consuming, hugely distracting process to get a license that can take up to a year. What's the reality, and what can it be and should it be, if you like?
Well, I guess that's probably come from compliance consultants selling their licensing service. But look, it can take a bit of time to get your license application. And there were periods of time over the past couple of years where ASIC was so under-resourced it was impossible to get things out in a reasonable time. Look, if you look at the standards on the ASIC website, they generally try to hit it within 150 days. And if you look at the data from last year, over 70% of the business was done within that period of time. So there's always going to be outlier cases. What we've found is that the applications that normally take longer are generally caused by the applicant themselves. The applicant who hasn't understood that they've actually got another entity in the fray, that their shareholdings or their use of a family trust causes problems down the track, or that the people that they want to put forward as responsible managers won't meet the requirements. So what we saw last year is that license applications were going through pretty quickly. The quickest one we got was in about 6 weeks. But even one that we put in just before Christmas, we're already starting, or we're probably 90% of the way to having the license approved. And that's given the fact that ASIC was shut down for a couple of weeks. So the issues aren't currently with the regulator, or the issues where there are delays, it's normally because the people aren't prepared for the application themselves, or they've chosen to do it themselves, and that requires them to do a lot of pre-work. So there are a lot of regulatory guides to read, if you're wanting to go and do your license and do your own application. There's a lot to understand about how the law works, and even the applications process itself can be a bit complicated. And then on top of that, you've got to write your own proofs to support the assertions and the statements you're making in your license application. So it can take you up to 12 months. If you do it yourself, you do it end to end, and you do everything that's required. But if you engage an external expert or a service that can knows what they're doing, it should take significantly less time than that.
So what would people be thinking in terms of, if they decided today up, to when the license application will be lodged? Is that, typically sort of 3 months sort of work?
We do things a bit differently. So there are some service providers where you say, I want to do a license, they'll log onto the system, they'll type stuff into the application form and it's done, right? You got an application in the system and they can take the payment, move on, and it's your problem to deal with the fallout. What we tend to do, run it as almost like a project management piece, which we work with the applicants to actually build the documents they're going to need for their license, build their monitoring supervision, so that when they get their license, if anyone comes to look, if ASIC knock on the door and say, show us how you do it, everything's in place. And because they've built it, it's actually consistent with their business and how they do it. So we tend to say, look, from the moment you make a decision to get a license, you presume it's going to take at least 4 to 6 weeks before you're in a position to lodge, because you're going to have to get references. You're going to have to get police checks and credit checks, and those things take time. And generally what takes the longest amount of time are those references. Because you're going to find someone who's worked with you, who can say all those wonderful things about you and is prepared to do so in writing. So, assume 4 to 6 weeks to lodgement, and then another 6 to 8 weeks after that.
And one thing we hear is, it can be a very expensive process. Again, it's a bit of how long is a piece of string, but what's the sort of costs involved in putting together an application and the lodgement fees?
Yeah, so I mean, it always depends on the nature, scale and complexity of the business, right? So if you're doing an application for Citibank, for example, or the Westpac Group, it's going to be charged accordingly because there are a lot more risks and a lot more complications. For a business, a couple of advisors, 3 advisors, 20 staff, single location, that type of stuff, you're probably looking around $10,000 to $15,000. You can get cheaper places, and if you go to the law firms, you can get more expensive prices as well. They all price in those aspects. The only thing I'd say about that pricing process is the same thing that I think applies to financial advice is, don't confuse the cost with value. You can find some really, really cheap service providers that are absolutely hopeless. You can find some really expensive ones who aren't much better than the ones you could have got at a reasonable price. So my advice is to shop around. Generally, you probably expect between 8 and 30,000. 30,000 is if you're doing derivatives and a lot of complex activities, maybe some product manufacturing as well. If you're just an advice business, we want to do the stock standard advise and dealing and all those bits, pieces, no custody, you're probably looking about $10,000, $12,000 end-to-end process.
Yeah, and I think, key point, do the due diligence on the consultants you're looking to use and make sure you're clear what you're getting. I was talking to one advisor the other day that, got the license, and that was pretty easy, but then had 6 months worth of work bedding down all the documentation that was kind of not really there. So, I thought I think they thought they were getting something different, and then they still had to do the work, but it was just kick the can down the road. So I think, do your due diligence on your consultants as well as anything else. Yeah.
That's the real challenge, because you don't know. You haven't often done many licenses, right? So you've made the decision to get a license. You haven't gone through that process before.
Yeah.
So it's very easy for someone to say, look, it's quick. We're just going to log on, answer these questions. Bob's your uncle. It goes through. But it's once you've got your license and then you look at things and go, hang on, I don't actually have this covered off. So what do I need to do? And this is where you've got to make that decision about what your time's worth as well.
Yeah.
And how much you're prepared to put into it. So the more you put into it in that formation stage of developing the proofs and the documents you're going to need, the better you'll be once you get your license.
Yeah, exactly. There's a bit of opportunity cost there, isn't there? One of the things that I often hear and makes people nervous about going self-licensed is the perception that they have increased liability. What are your thoughts on that, Sean?
Look, for better or worse, the reality is if you're doing anything in financial services, you've got this massive sort of Damocles hanging over your head anyway, right? You've got liability for everything. You've got the capacity for the regulator to look at you. You've got Africa. You've got plaintiff lawyers. You've got a whole range of people who will scrutinise what you do and look at those bits and pieces. The difference in terms of liability, and sure, the licensee bears liability, but realistically, the same liabilities are present if you're an authorised rep in another licence. The big difference, I think, in terms of liability when you're running your own licence is you know what all the risks are, right? It's your business, it's your conduct. You know what you do, and you know what the people you're working with are doing. If you're in a big group that's got 400 advisors across Australia, how can you possibly know what's going on and how a disaster in Toowoomba, for example, or advisor misconduct up there can filter through the group and have an impact on you?
Yeah, the brand damage.
We suddenly have to do all these bits and pieces. So you forget about the liability side of things. If you're a good advisor running a good business and getting good advice, your liability is going to be relatively low. You know, same as any type of business. The more complex, the more convoluted you want to get, and the more closer to the edge you want to get, the greater liability and the greater your chance of being actually discovered.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about what's involved in running the license shortly. But again, there's a perception that costs are going to go up because there's all this extra work of running a license.
Yeah.
And what do you think of that from a cost perspective?
Look, I always am surprised by that cost, because you look at what licensees are charging now. So in the old days, you used to be able to get an authorisation, 15 grand, right? Some licenses are at the moment quoting around $80,000 or that type of thing. And when you look at a practice with a couple of advisors and maybe a paraplanner all getting authorisations, it's not uncommon for that to be, 60, 70, 80,000 or more per year. I know some groups that were paying over $100,000 to their licensee before they got their license. Now, once you get your license, there's a whole range of things you need to do. But again, you're not paying for a lot of things that maybe the institutional licensee has taken on board that you never took any advantage of. So licensees can provide you with a group buying discount. That's the great attraction of those types of issues. But generally, if you're running a business in a single location with one or two advisors, I think you probably end up, and you take out your professional indemnity insurance, your costs are all manageable. So what do you got? You got your PI, right? Your PI might be about, I don't know, let's assume $16,000 or 2%, 2.2% of your revenue. You got your ASIC levy, which might cost you about, I don't know, say $1,000 per advisor per year. You got your AFCA membership, which will cost you a couple of $100. And then you've got your statutory lodgement fees. So you might have your financial audit. Let's assume that might cost you about $5,000 a year. They're your direct costs that are under your control. And then you've got things like advisor reviews and external support, which again, you can control. So the costs are actually quite manageable when you break it down and when you understand what you're doing. The challenge, I would say, is that if you go into getting a license only to save yourself money, you're actually doing yourself a disservice, because you find out that you won't actually have the stuff you actually do need.
Yeah.
The investments in compliance and resources that you need.
Yeah, it's probably the wrong reason to be getting a license, isn't it? Finally, one of the things I know there's probably a bit of confusion around in the industry around when people are moving licenses, the requirement for kind of doing new advice documents for every client, a foundation SOA. What are your thoughts on that? Is that an automatic must do, or does it depend on the circumstances?
I mean, at law, there's no such thing as a foundation SOA. Right? Okay, so you don't need to worry about the foundation SOA. That requirement is normally driven by your authorised rep agreement. So between the licensee, because your previous licensee will say within 12 months or 6 months or 3 months of you leaving, we want you to generate a new statement of advice for your client. Now, they want to do that because they're trying to draw a line in the sand to say, after that point, our hands are clean. We're not responsible for anything but no liability. That's not how the law works anyway. That licensee is always going to be responsible for the advice that is given under their license. But it's more a device. And what it's crept in is it's a way of trying to move a client across to the new license. Now, depending on how you've structured it. So if you get a license, say you're an existing practice at the moment, and you get a license through a new entity, and then you authorise your corporate and you authorise yourself and the other people, as authorised reps, right? Corporate authorised reps or authorised reps. The providing entity in that case has not changed. Okay, so there's no need to generate a new foundation SOA because the SOA that was provided by the providing entity hasn't changed, right? That person, that advisor in that case, the authorised rep, is still an authorised rep under a new authorised entity, but still, so you can rely on the old SOA. So you don't need to move it across. If you move to a license, the providing entity. So if you don't have that intervening corporate entity and you're moving to a new license, the providing entity has changed. And so logically, you want to produce a statement of advice as soon as you can so that you can then start to use records of advice. Now, what you might want to do is issue a statement of advice. It doesn't have to be the 80 or 90, 100 pages it used to. That is quite short. It's just incorporating by reference previous documents. You know, this is a statement of advice issued under my new license, blah, blah, blah. It incorporates my statement of advice provided to you under this license on this date and incorporates our conversations with them.
You can streamline the process.
They can streamline, you can manage it really well. And that's why it's important not only to understand the structure under which you're going to hold the license and put it together, but then what your actual obligations are. Yeah. And if you're going to get a license, you need to understand what your obligations are because it's going to be your responsibility from the moment you get your license.
Mm-hmm. For those that kind of aren't familiar, and I didn't want to go into a huge amount of detail here because we could probably speak for the whole hour or even more about this, but kind of want to give a bit of an overview of what's actually involved in getting a license for those that aren't too, the sort of documentation you've got to pull together, capital requirements, etc.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that they're going to be looking for. So first and foremost, they're going to want to look to see whether or not the entity that's applying for a license has an idea about what they're going to do. So what they look for is a business plan. So it's one of your initial proofs, which summarises the business, how it operates, what it's likely to do, how many advisors it's going to have. It's to give ASIC an understanding of when you get a license, this is where you're going to operate. Mm-hmm. So if your business plan says, we're going to have by within 6 months of getting a license, we're going to have 4,000 advisors operating in every city in Australia, but ASIC are going to look at that and go, well, where are your resources for that? Where's your capability and whatever else? So they're going to look for that business plan. Then they're going to look towards, okay, who are the people that are actually going to be responsible for this license? Who are the responsible managers? The people on whom the licensee is going to depend to make sure it complies with the law. Now, they're going to ask for references for those people. They're going to look at the qualifications of those people, both the formal qualifications and the experience, and look at their competency. And this is where I mentioned before about getting references and about getting checks. It's all about looking at those people to make sure that they are fit and proper people. And in fact, every director and responsible manager who's put forward needs to have a fit and proper person check, which is a statement that looks at their history. Have they been previously licensed? Have they been banned, discredited, all those bits and pieces? So they're the application pieces. Then ASIC look at a range of proofs that go to the substance of your business. So how do you intend to monitor and supervise your representatives? What's your risk management framework look like? What does your compliance framework look like? How are you going to handle insurance? If you're going to do margin lending, and how are you going to handle margin calls, and what platforms are you going to use? In terms of platforms, what about other products? How do you construct your APL? Who manages your APL? How frequently do you change it? So they're looking for the nuts and bolts about how this license is going to work. If you're going to do all these things, how can you satisfy us as the regulator that you know what you're doing? So do you have policies and structures and arrangements that demonstrate that? Because that's what they'll be looking at. They're going to see, well, your risk management process is a bit defective. And what happens is when you put your application in, they look at those things. So when you put your application in, they won't ask for every single proof, depending on your authorization. They'll ask for key proofs. They'll ask for proofs about your RMs, your business plan. Are you an AFCA member? Have you got an auditor? Or do you have professional indemnity insurance? And they'll ask for key documents as well, and they'll go through those. So at the moment, they're really interested in the structure of organisations. So if you're applying for a license, who owns the entity that's applying? Who are the shareholders? Who are the directors? Are any of the directors in that business or one of the parent entities previously been banned? And so they're really interested in understanding not just the applicant, but anyone who can influence the applicant. which is a real change over the past couple of years, which has come out of the Royal Commission.
Right. So the more that they're going a lot more than just a ticker box process of reviewing that, they're going into the
and that's good. That's a good thing. So anyone who gets a license who's gone through that process can take comfort in the fact that the other people who are getting licensed or the other licensed entities have been subjected to the same degree of rigor. So it should cut out a lot of the cowboys who shouldn't be in our industry and who are really damaging our industry, which again is one of your FASIA obligations as an advisor, really, is to monitor the industry and to keep to make sure you're identifying and appropriately dealing with people who are damaging the credibility of our industry.
100%. And what's the capital requirements for getting a license these days?
Yeah, so what ASIC there are a couple of two basic levels there. Okay, so you've got to be solvent. So your assets have to exceed your liabilities at any particular point in time. But then what they're also looking for is, do you have enough capital to run your business on an ongoing basis? Sure, you've got assets greater than liabilities. Do you have enough cash flow? Do you have enough money coming in? Now, for most businesses, what you'll do is you'll choose a model that looks at, it projects forwards, it looks at your expenses over a period of time, what the contingencies are, look at your reasonable assumption, and ASIC and RG166 will say, keep a chunk of cash aside. Now, normally it's around 20% of your 3 months projected expenses. So what ASIC is saying is if you've got that amount and you've got cash flow coming in, you're going to be able to maintain your business. And as a licensee, you're going to monitor your capital adequacy on a regular basis. So on a monthly basis, you're going to keep an eye on it. But also every 3 months, you're going to check those figures to make sure on a rolling basis, you've got adequate capital to sustain your business. The reality is in small businesses, the principals look at their capital all the time. Right? They're always looking at do we have the money to go in? And that's the nature of small business. They're pretty well run, even though there's a lot of tension, a lot of stress in the initial period of time. Most successful advice businesses, which are practices initially, when they get their licenses, they're just applying the same discipline and rigor that they had in their practice to their license, and they tend to be okay.
Yeah. And I know there's a few, like I know PI insurance is usually one of the conditions of issuing it, that it's actually, you've got that in place. So and that can trip people up sometimes, either through the unexpected cost or maybe, I don't know what it's like now, but certainly a year or so ago, it could be a bit challenging to actually get PI. Any sort of things that can trip people up you're aware of that like that?
I think the reality is that what tends to trip people up when they're going through the application process is they misunderstand what they're applying for when they do their application. So they ask for stuff that they've put derivatives on because derivatives are sexy, and wouldn't it be good to be able to put that in the FSG, not realising, hang on, I've got additional obligations there and my PI goes up. Margin lending, there are certain activities that if you want to operate an MDA, your PI is going to go up. Right? That's not recommending an MDA, but operate a bit. And so it's about looking at your activities, and also, and this is a critical part, looking at the advisors you're going to have in your business and where they came from. Because the PI market's pretty competitive at the moment, so they don't really need to price risk. They can pretty much decide what they want to charge, and you don't have a lot of choice. There are only really 3 providers at the moment. But the reality is, if you've got a lot of advisors who want to join your group who come from licenses that are under a cloud or have been under a cloud themselves, formerly banned or named or something, that can really blow out your PI, which is why you've really got to do your reference checking properly before you bring anyone into your license. Now, the ASIC consultation paper 333, the reference checking, comments for that consultation paper closed yesterday. But essentially what that's focusing on is your obligation as a licensee to properly vet anyone coming in. And what I would say to you, you're going to get your license, even if you're going to bring in people that you've known for a long period of time, great mates, people you've known from around the traps, do the proper reference checking. Because that failure and some of the things that can flow out of that, about complaints you don't know about, whatever else, can really, blow up your PI and make it much more expensive. At the moment, it's still around 2.2% of your revenue, unless you've got some of those complicating factors. But it's going to cost you at least $16,000, I'd say conservatively, for PI, which is probably what you're paying in your license at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting that it doesn't dramatically change sort of up or down. So, yeah. Now, again, don't want to sort of labour this too much, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what's involved. So, you said, getting the licence is one thing.
Yep.
What do you need to think about and what's involved in running it? Now, I saw someone the other day and I kind of liken it a bit to the process of having a self-managed super fund, where as long as you're clear about the kind of requirements and you set up the routines and you minute things, it doesn't need to be overly onerous. But I'd love your thoughts on kind of, what's required, how to structure it, and how do you make sure you're ticking all those boxes for the ongoing management of the license?
And that's something that people tend to miss. One of the things you want to make sure is to systematise all the stuff that you possibly can. So when you put your application in, one of the things you're doing in your application, you put your policies in, you're saying, oh, we're going to review our policies on at least an annual basis. Great. So how do you make sure that occurs? Yeah. Well, the simplest way to do it is to have a compliance framework, which might be a reg tech system, or it could be something as simple as, an organisational diary where you say, okay, we're going to review all the policies on the 24th of April every year. And you put that in your diary so that it's done. Then hang on, we also have to have research committee meetings. We told ASIC we're going to do it every 2 months. Okay, let's put it in the diary and do it that way. So you go through systematically, look at all your obligations. Our advisors need to be reviewed. How often are we going to do that? Are we going to do that annually? We're going to do it in this weekly period here, put it in the diary. When any of those tasks are allocated, and any task you put in your diary, you should make sure you link back to a specific obligation, whether it's policy or a legal requirement, so you know what's going on, and you make sure that it's allocated to somebody. So we use something called OpenAFSL, which is a reg tech platform, and the compliance framework in that has all the necessary tasks built into it. And what you do is you allocate those tasks to people, and you create escalation, and you create dates so that tasks are allocated. So they're popping in your diary, you know when you have to do it, and it's tracked. And if it's not done, it escalates, which is a good way to do those things. But you can also take a step back and see everything we need to do over the course of the year. So if your auditor comes in, your financial auditor or ASIC come in, you can say, here's what we do, and here's proof we've done it. And what you can do is you can supplement that with attestations. So you send emails out to the relevant people under your license to do stuff, and they can confirm it. So you've always got a record that you can demonstrate again that we're taking it seriously and we're managing it professionally. And that's, like I said, you can use technology to do that. You can use relatively simple technology. It's a matter of discipline. But the more you can automate and the more you can supplement with automation, the easier it'll be for you, and it won't distract you from your core function, which might be providing advice or leading the team.
And I gather, if you had sort of like a quarterly RM meeting, something like that is often kind of the major, impost in terms of time and effort to sort of have that to go through and have a distinct meeting around running the license on a quarterly basis. Is that? Yeah,
so a quarterly meeting's good. Some groups do it the larger groups might do it on a monthly basis because they've got enough data to do it. In a small business, generally, quarterly or half yearly is enough.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's only two of you sit next to each other. Taking 2 hours a month to run through what you've been doing is probably overkill. So depending on the nature, scale and complexity of your business, quarterly is fine. And then you just want you want to make sure you time those things so they're related to the other activities. So if you've got your audit function booked in for April, you make sure you have your compliance committee in May, so you're reviewing the report. So you're looking at the evidence, and then you'll have another one a couple of months later to look at, okay, we got the reports, all these issues were identified, have we fixed them?
Yeah.
And that's where you want that level of transparency around that. Again, small businesses tend to do less formal compliance meetings, but they do it more frequently because it's almost in the DNA of their day-to-day activities. You just can't avoid it in a small business.
And I guess things like investment committees are really dependent on the nature of the business. So again, a one-man band running fairly simple investment solutions would be very different to a multi-advisor practice running SMAs, where they probably need a quite significant investment committee with maybe some external skills coming on to provide some horsepower.
No, I think even in smaller groups, you're probably going to want that external assistance anyway. I mean, the difficulty is that getting a license and saying, oh, you know, our research policy says we can use anything that's rated 4 stars by Morningstar. Well, that's not a research policy, right? That doesn't give your advisors confidence about, well, you know, are all the products the same? Are all the products appropriate? There needs to be more around that. So there are some definite skills that you can do there. But I'd agree with you, Graham, is that when you're looking at those types of things, is don't be afraid to engage the external experts to help you either structure it and to run it. Because particularly with investments, having someone external who can actually, you know, challenge your thinking. You might be great at building model portfolios and no client has ever complained, but sometimes having an external party look at it, you know, look at the testing against benchmarks, doing some recursion testing, and really break it down, they might significantly improve your process. They might highlight some of the issues that you probably weren't aware of. And that's the real challenge with having a license, is having enough maturity and capacity to actually be challenged about the way in which you're doing things. Because if I look at some of the licenses that got themselves, you know, had their licenses taken away or whatever, they were businesses that decided to do things in a particular way and never questioned the way in which they approached it. You know, we're doing it like this, we think that's fine. And until they get their businesses shut down and their advisors banned, they never think to actually check with somebody else.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know, do you? And I think that's why, you know, using any sort of external consultant is great, because it gives you that fresh pair of eyes and things that you, and the amount of change happening legislatively, it's almost impossible to stay across that yourself, isn't it?
We've just been working on the compliance planner on our website, right? Tracking all the regulatory changes across 2020 and putting them on a simple calendar for clients, so they can go in and go, oh, hang on, I know what this is and when it's going to kick in. And there's a lot, right? Yeah. There's a lot. I know it might surprise you, but there's a lot of regulatory change in 2021. Yeah. And even the things that you thought, oh, we don't have to worry about for a while, given the government's gone slow on things, we've still got unfair contracts. We've still got enhanced breach reporting. We've still got reference checking. We've got potential remediation changes. We had conflicted rem that happened on 1st of January. So, you know, you've got these brief periods throughout the year where nothing happens, and then you've got periods where there's a lot of activity. So if you're going to do it yourself, there's a lot of time you're going to have to allocate to it. And that's not a bad thing. You know, it's compliance is the most fun thing in the world, but it's going to take time, right? It's going to take time and energy that you might be better spent actually seeing clients, providing advice and generating income.
Now, before we move off the compliance considerations, I just had one of the attendees had a quick question. Just if you could reiterate just very briefly around that SOA requirements if people move to their own AFSL. If you could
okay. So when you look at the law talks about who is the providing entity. So when you look at an SOA, and the licensee is the providing entity where the advisor is an employee, right? Where they're an authorised representative, the authorised representative is the providing entity. So that means, if for example, an authorised rep goes from Graham Financial Services to Bernard Financial Services, the authorised rep doesn't need to reissue SOAs because they issued the previous SOA. They can, when they do a review, issue a new review SOA under the licence, but there's nothing that changes. Yeah. Right? Everything changes. You might want to, so you don't necessarily need to do a new foundation SOA. The need for the foundation SOA is a purely contractual piece, right? So it's look at your authorised representative agreement, and a lot of licensees will insist on it as a way to try to hive off liability. Yeah, right? It doesn't often work like that. Their view is that if someone goes from Graham Financial Services to Bernard Financial Services and issue an SOA that reiterates or endorses the advice that's given under my license, and a claim comes in, well, I can turn around and say, well, hang on, that's Bernard Financial Services' problem because they reiterated it. The reality is the original licensee is liable because the advice was given under there. It's just, it tries to muddy the waters and make it more difficult from that perspective, but really that's a fast. Though there are good reasons to issue a new SOA once you shift, and that's more about branding and positioning and making sure. So if you go into a licensee where you've got significantly more capacity, broader authorizations, a very different pricing model, then you might want to issue an SOA.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't have to if you're an authorised rep. If you've gone for an employee, if you've gone from an authorised rep and get your own licence, when you've got your own licence, if you're a director or an employee of the licence, you're not an authorised rep anymore. So there is a change of the providing entity. So it means that you're going to have to issue an SOA under your own licence at some point.
Right. Right. Well, thanks, Sean. We're going to jump on to some sort of non-compliance related. By all means, stick around, Sean, because I'm sure some other things will kick up, will come through unless you need to duck off. But I wanted to talk now a bit about technology, because it is going to be one of the key considerations when you change licensees, and certainly when you get your own license, because most licensees providing the technology solution is core. And the reality is, no matter how low touch you want it to be, you are going to have to both incur some costs and some work. So even if, for example, you're using Xplan today and you want to take out Xplan under your own license, you're probably going to have an increase in cost, for example, because they IRS price differently for a small business compared to a large AMP or IOOF kind of sale. So you need to understand the pricing of that and how that license fee is going to change. And also, when you get things like Xplan in particular, you're effectively getting a blank page. So the templates and workflows and systems you've been using that have probably been provided by your licensee, you're going to need to rebuild or build from scratch. So you're probably going to need to look at getting an Xplan consultant on board and paying them to help build those workflows to replace what's been provided by your licensee. So the reality is, I think it's actually a great opportunity if you're making this decision to rethink your technology and make sure what you're using is best of breed and best suited to you, and taking advantage of the huge developments we've seen in fintech. So I think it's worth spending some time actually unpacking what technology both you're currently using today and what could you be using and what's out there in a broader sense. So what we'd suggest is you kind of look at those major elements of your business and what are the technology requirements you have. So for example, what's going to hold all your client information, be your CRM if you like, where's your portfolio data going to sit, what's your advice preparation tool, revenue management, because obviously moving forward you're going to have to do what we used to call commission management. I suppose with no commissions, it's just straight revenue management now, but the flows from the product providers need to be tracked and dispersed. Ideally a workflow management tool may or may not be the same as your CRM, and a document repository which is robust enough for a compliance review and keep track of that. In the past, and I guess still the mainstay of the industry, is people look at an end-to-end solution for all of that. So looking at using an Xplan or a Midwinter or Advisor Logic are all great tools, but they're sort of built as an end-to-end all-encompassing solution from the CRM right through to the advice preparation and workflow management and the like. But what we're seeing, and I'm sure I don't know if you're seeing many of your clients moving this way, is a lot of people starting to unpack this value chain or this process chain and start to say, well, what are the best of breed elements I can use? Because one of the downsides of using an end-to-end is you might find that you have to have an Xplan, a full Xplan license with all the tools, bells and whistles for 8 of your staff members, and that can start to be very expensive. Whereas what people are starting to do is say, okay, I can unpack that. I might have a best of breed CRM. There's things like Work Sorted, Salesforce or derivatives of Salesforce, Sado. There's a number of tools built as specialist CRMs for financial advice businesses. Some of them include revenue management like Work Sorted, but certainly workflow is usually embedded in that. And you'll probably find that the workflow tools are much easier to use than Xplan. You're able to craft your own workflows quite easily. I've got one client who's probably a self-confessed Luddite, and she had never really used workflows before, and she has very quickly been able to use a simple CRM to build workflows. She's using Work Sorted, but I'm sure a number of these are very simple to use, particularly not saying Xplan is not good at that. It's just almost too good and very powerful. And if you're just a sole practitioner, maybe overkill for what you need, and you want something you can drive yourself. So if you start to unpack these elements, you might find that okay, yeah, I still need an advice preparation tool like Xplan or Midwinter to create my advice and do my modeling, but I only need one license for that. And maybe even it's only a paraplanner needs a license. So you might be able to reduce the cost quite dramatically and end up with tools that are fit for purpose. Sean, are you seeing sort of more people starting to go that route?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about the way technology has developed over the past couple of years is that you have a lot more choice and a lot more flexibility over costs, right? Because I think, there are some software you can get which can do everything, which is, as you point out, a massive overkill for most businesses, and I'll never even use a fraction of it. What you could look at it as almost like an application stack. So you, in exactly the way you've identified it there, you find the best solution for those particular functions and figure out how they can tie together, how they can work with each other or leverage off each other, because you might end up with a far better tailored and bespoke solution that's cheaper than what you can get off the shelf from the big guys. And this is where taking the time to think about your business and getting people who actually understand the practice management technology and how it all fits together, it seems like a luxury, but it will save you so much time, energy and inconvenience that it's something you should really think about before you
investment, isn't it? So if you look at those single sort of all-encompassing systems, there's some obvious advantages. You don't have to worry about systems integration, because it all is under the one umbrella. You've got a single source of truth for data and a single source of support. So you've got one help desk you can go to either from your licensee or from the software provider themselves. But we're seeing, as Sean said, quite a bit of change in this space over the last couple of years. So, there's a number of what you call best of breed solutions coming into place. And so you can access this newer technology with great client engagement tools, very different look and feel, and using much more contemporary technology, both within your practice or with clients. It can be a really different outcome. And the big change is the amount of systems integration and the ease of that. Sean, what were you going to say? Sorry.
I was going to say the other thing to think about is the advantage of using multiple sources is you don't have a cube situation.
Yeah.
Where you put all your eggs in one basket and the basket breaks.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to clean up afterwards, or you're relying on one party, which means you're vulnerable to them and you're vulnerable to their pricing as well. So they're all things to think about, and think about the ways in which you can put it together.
Yeah. And look, in the past, systems integration has probably been the number one challenge when you're building a bespoke tech stack. But now with more and more providers having open APIs and sort of really building with this concept of connectivity, most, particularly of the contemporary systems, are actually really good at bringing in, pushing out data as need be. And you're starting to see tools like, I think Work Sorted and Midwinter now have built a connection. And you're seeing more and more of that because they're realizing that people will choose to do this. So some of those issues in the past about double entry of data and worried about single source of truth can potentially have been resolved or much more mitigated. So again, you can unpack that when you talk to the providers. And as Sean said, you may end up with something that's significantly more cost effective, even though it's giving you a better outcome with more usable solutions. So, moving licensees, sometimes you're pretty limited in how you can change your tech stack because you're probably going to the software of that new licensee. But going out on your own is a really exciting opportunity, I think, at the moment, to have that blank sheet of paper to say, well, what is the best of breed technology solution we could embrace that will actually really enhance our productivity and improve our customer experience, etc. Some other things you're going to need to think about, like I said, is develop new templates. So even if you're retaining the software that you've been using in the licensee, you're probably going to have to build new document templates and build new workflows. And data migration is also a key. So if you're moving out, say, of an IOOF version of Xplan, and you've taken out a direct version with Iris of your own Xplan, data migration will still be an issue because it won't map directly across, because there'll be fields in your current version of Xplan that won't map. So you're going to need some support in that data migration, whether it's to a new system, a Midwinter, or a different CRM. You'll need to think about that and again, price that and be aware of the time and effort in that And again, that's regardless. Whenever you're moving licensees, data migration is going to be an issue and something you're going to need to invest in. The other thing is, spend some time really mapping your processes today, because you are going to lose access to some of those things that you might have just taken for granted. So be really clear. What are your workflows and processes in your business? Don't just rely on the workflows that are in your CRM, because you may need to rebuild them. But once again, it's a great opportunity to step back and say, is that process working well? Is it optimal? We've always done it this way. Can we do it differently? Is this just a requirement from our licensee? But make sure you unpack that and understand that before you flick the switch and have made the change. So you're really clear what's working and how to replicate it if you want to rebuild those workflows either in Xplan or in a new CRM. And importantly, what's your technology support? You probably do need to provide, if you're out on your own, make sure you've got a good tech person to support some of this stuff and help with the conversations around data migration. So that becomes important as well. One of the other things we obviously get from licensees that you need to think about is your access to training, education, and indeed community. Now, sometimes the community is really important for some people, and others might find that they're happy to leave the licensee because they're not really gelling, or they don't have in their state many members of the same licensee. But it is a chance to sort of look at, okay, what are you going to do for education? Now, I think, again, one of the advantages when you're self-licensed is you can really pick and choose where do you get your professional development. So what we're seeing with a lot of our clients is they're going, actually enjoying not having to spend 2 days, a day or 2 days at a PD day where someone else has put together the agenda. I can pick a conference that I want to go to that's really in my wheelhouse and I'm excited by and interested. Could be a conference on SMAs, could be on alternative investments, could be going to the SPA conference on self-managed super strategies. But you can really tailor your own education and get that CPD content from stuff that's actually of interest to you. And I think that's kind of really important. But you will probably need to make sure you've got a portal for tracking your CPD points. And then think about how you're going to replace that community. If you do have a community within your licensee that you're part of, for some people that's really important. But again, there's great opportunities to form peer groups or be part of peer groups. And we know at Elixir, we run a number of different peer groups, and it's probably one of the most enjoyable parts of the job, because you've got people in a room who are sharing ideas, they're like-minded, they don't see each other as competitors. They'll talk about everything from how much they charge for advice to what are you paying staff, and it becomes really powerful because you've got that whole benefit of, many minds at work on a problem rather than just one. So I think that finding and creating peer groups is important, because, it can be a lonely exercise being a planner. It can be even lonelier if you're a planner running in your own license, if you don't create that. But Sean, what are your thoughts on kind of opportunities for, interesting education and finding that sort of support?
Yeah, I think your ability to do that tailored training is really effective. I was just nodding madly when you're talking about peer groups, because we started to run licensee RM sessions last year. And what I expected is that we cover off the regulatory, the strategic issues and whatever else. But to your point is that when you get professional people in a room together where they're interacting with people who are peers or their equivalents, they do talk and share information that's much broader. Mm-hmm. And so the development actually goes far beyond, the FCA requirements of their CPD or whatever. There's some really valuable professional development that they would not get from a PD day.
Yeah. I can see, and I've been part of one, and you have too, Sean. You can't help yourself but be there telling advisors, because licensees seem to think they know best, and have it. It's kind of almost in the DNA. So there's a lot of talking to, whereas I think we can create this environment when you're with peers where it's genuinely sharing information, maybe bringing in experts as need be to put forward some thoughts, but it's not like people are being dictated to. So it becomes really quite powerful, isn't it? And
there's less product flogging. I know that doesn't happen anymore, but those sessions where you go to and they'll talk about a platform in particular, advisors tend to want to know what the practicalities are.
Yeah.
you know, here's the client situation. How do we deal with these types of things? What's the best way to handle clients of this particular type? What about when we're dealing with wholesale clients? How should we approach it differently? And your ability for your peers to share that type of stuff and actually support each other and develop things, it's just really impressive and so much better than some of the traditional models.
Yeah, sure. Now, I'd like to touch briefly on fees, because again, you know, there's no implicit need when you move to self-license to change your fee structure, but it's a great opportunity to review your fees, both the structure and amount, etc. And I think really important, because you need to step back and say, well, how's it changed my cost to serve? You know, how's it gone up? Has it gone down? Be clear of the split between the costs of your advice business and your licensee. But, you know, look at that quantum of the fees and make sure you're getting an appropriate recompense and profit margin for the risks and liabilities associated with an effort of running a license. So you've got to build that in and make sure that's being delivered. And also it might be that you're going to start broadening and providing services that you haven't in the past. So how are you going to price those or replace those that the licensee has done for you? But you need to really step back and look at things from scratch. And interestingly, as I said before, Elixir every 2 years do a deep dive research of the market, where we've researched some 750 odd financial advisors around the country on how they price their advice across 273 different businesses. And when we analysed it and we actually sort of looked at those that were self-licensed versus in licensees, it was really interesting. It was one of the biggest points of difference in charging structure. And the self-licensed firms were charging, you know, not insignificantly greater amount for both initial advice, where their average fee charged for comprehensive advice without insurance from a self-licensed firm was on average $4,800 compared to around $3,800 to $3,200 for people authorised reps of smaller licenses. But even more so with ongoing fees, the average ongoing fee was $5,600 compared to $3,500, you know, $3,600 on average for the other firms. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. One thing we thought, well, is it just that they have a higher cost, so they're charging more? But then when we looked at it, they're also getting a higher profit margin. So it's clear that that higher revenue is not just being chewed up in higher costs. It would appear to be that there's a number of factors coming in. When we spoke to people, you know, part of it is because they have the discipline around running the license, there's the transparency, they're spending a bit more time working on their business. They've got a much greater awareness of their operating costs. So they kind of know how to price it. They're thinking more about an appropriate profit margin to reward the risk and effort rather than kind of the profit that's left over at the end of the day. So they're taking a more proactive view in pricing to generate a suitable profit margin. And again, they're probably more structured, and we're seeing a lot of the firms that have their own license investing a lot of time and effort in building processes and more rigorous implementation, which can end up with greater profitability through efficiency. So it's interesting that the self-licensed firms on average are charging more, but they're generating a higher profit margin as well. Sean, we don't have a lot of time left, but any particular thoughts on that?
I just had a question for you, actually, in terms of what it seems to me is that those businesses not only are more profitable and more efficient, but also when it comes to resale or selling or whatever else, get higher prices. And I wonder whether or not your research supports that general observation.
Yeah, so we didn't delve into sale prices per se, but again, I think the best proxy of that is the EBIT margin, because we're seeing more and more firms selling on a multiple of EBIT. So certainly these firms that have good processes, they're generating more EBIT. And then I think what we're seeing also is that the multiple of the EBIT is better for the firms with better processes and risk management. Yeah. And almost by definition, those firms that have self-licensed, that have that rigor and structure around that, have really good, well-documented, embedded processes in their business, which make that business really attractive as to purchase. So again, the multiple of EBIT probably goes up as well.
Yeah. We've been talking with some licensees at the moment who are acquiring other practices, other licensees, other businesses, and they're really focused on those businesses that have good processes, good structure. So even small licensees, licensed entities, but even practices that have their own place in place, there are so many benefits that come from that thing, and it was really good to see that your research supports that.
Yeah. Now, just really want to run through these last couple of points very quickly because we're just about out of time. We've touched a lot of this, but one of the things that can trip people up is getting distribution agreements in place before they go licensed, because again, that no manufacturer will be able to transfer the clients or pay you any revenue till that's in place. And believe me, it's a pain in the ass. If you have to go to 30 different manufacturers, there will be 30 different agreements with 30 different requirements. So you need to put aside some time to set that up. And there's a risk that, particularly, for example, if you've got 20% of your insurance revenue from one insurer, if that fails to come across and for whatever reason the execution of the document is delayed, that revenue can stop. So it's a significant risk, but something you really need to be on, have a really good structured process to get about and getting agreements in place, so, as close to the new business going live as possible. Paraplanning support might be something you've got from your licensee in the past. You may need to source that. And same with the technical support. Again, many licensees might be providing that. You might need to find some way of satisfying that as well. And finally, business structure, get some advice on that. Which entity do you need to create a new entity to own the license? Don't, generally and Sean, you're probably better to comment on this, but I've heard that, you don't want the business that owns your financial planning business to be the business that necessarily takes out the license. You might want to have a separate entity with the license. Again, shorter time, but Sean, any thoughts there?
I think that business protections piece is really important. The only other thing I'd emphasise there is look at your existing agreements before you make a decision to go. Particularly look at your authorised rep agreement to see what parameters it puts and what other hurdles they might impose.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to start to go down that route and then find out that it changes pricing or it changes your fee structures or increases your fees or anything. Do that work up front so you're not surprised.
Yeah. And then I guess finally, we talked briefly about this, but when you're from the investment perspective, you are going to need to formulate your own APL and have the structure, as Sean talked about, how you arrived at that decision. But again, this is a bit of a blank sheet of paper. You've probably had a relatively constrained APL in terms of the platforms and solutions. Now the market's open to you. So which platform, you need to do your due diligence. Is this a time when you can start to look at SMAs if you haven't, how you want to structure it? And this will sort of impact the investment committee. So you need to be clear on ideally how you want to manage money. And then you can look around at what's the best platform, most cost competitive, because it may be different to what you've been using in the past. There's a lot to think about, and we've only touched the surface. So I'm just finalising, putting together a bit of a checklist of thoughts to go through and look at. So that'll be made available in the next few days to all the participants that dialed in today. So you will get that as a tool to sort of think about the things you need to go through. It'll be as exhaustive as we can think of, but there'll probably always other things you need to work through, but it will get you thinking about what needs to be done. So to wrap, because we're sort of a couple of minutes over, just finally, where to from here? So I think that the priority is be really clear about your business vision. What is it that you're looking to be in 3 years from now? So that's think of that business having a license and what's involved in running that and the costs of that. So be really clear when you're talking to someone like Sean, this is me today, but in 3 years we expect to have this. How would that work? Be clear on the likes and dislikes of being an authorised rep. So you're moving for the right reasons and don't go in with the rose-coloured glasses. Some things won't change, some things will change. So be really clear on that. Talk early to the right consultants, people like Sean, IT solutions, etc. So you're really clear on the costs and the work requirements, and factor into those costs all the hidden things where you might need to do the data migration, the building new templates, etc. And also when you start to then do the cost benefit analysis, think of the opportunity cost. So if you're taking 2 months out of your business to put together all this license application, what does that mean in terms of new business you'll be able to write? What's the opportunity cost? So factor that into the cost benefit analysis. So once you've done all of that homework, be clear on the work you need to do, the time and effort you need to put into both get and then run the license. What are the costs of getting it and running it? You can then do that detailed cost benefit analysis, make the decision. Then if it is the right decision, then do a really detailed implementation plan. So, what do you got to be done prior to the application, during the application, prior to sort of kicking off the license and giving notice to your current licensee, and then post that. make sure all of those workflows are identified, and again, so you minimize surprises. And I'm sure, Sean, all the ones that you've seen where it's not been a great process is when there've been surprises, and it's probably because the homework wasn't done. So obviously, at Elixir, we're certainly here to help. We have access to obviously a range of different experts, but we spend a lot of time working through people, helping them with this business analysis and discovery process to work out where they're at, where they want to be, and what's involved. Then manage a strategy process to plan the business overall. And Sean talked about the importance of having a clear business plan. That ASIC, we wanted that. That's what we do all day, every day. But importantly, as you're building this new business, and I do think it's an opportunity to create a new business, what are all the things you need to think about? Software, technology, staff training, all sorts of things. We can help with that. And then ultimately move into, a bespoke coaching engagement where we help you bring to life your plans. That's really what it's about for us. We don't impose, our business model on you. It's really about, what do you want to build? And then we can help you get there. And I'm sure, Sean, you would be available to help people understand what's involved in the license application and management process if they're wanting to have a chat.
Yes, certainly. And we've got a lot of material on our website as well on self-licensing, what to think about, what to do. There's a lot of material, and you can always email us at help@SeanSport, and we'll do it.
I would recommend you go on to Sean's website, and he's got a newsletter that goes out every second Tuesday, 3 Hit Tuesday, with just always three really interesting insights into what's happening in the industry from a regulatory compliance perspective, and always entertainingly written. So regardless of what you're doing, whether you stay where you're at, everyone I think would find it valuable. So go in and register for that email. It's a great newsletter that Sean puts out. So thanks very much. I would like to take some questions, but we're unfortunately out of time. But feel free to email any questions through. Give me a call or one of my colleagues at Elixir, or certainly Sean. Go onto his website. He said he has a lot of information. We'd love to help you work through what can be a really challenging decision. This session wasn't meant to say that getting a license is the right thing. It's got to be the right thing for you. So we want to help you unpack that, make that decision from an informed perspective, so you really know what you're getting yourself in for, cost-wise, effort-wise, liability-wise, etc. But the flip side is it's a great opportunity to make some big, dramatic changes in your business and really set it up for the future of what's going to be a great advice opportunities moving forward. Thanks for your time, Sean. Really appreciate your openness and candor and giving us a lot of really good information. Yeah, and we look forward to talking again soon. So thanks, everybody, and talk to you all through the course of 2021. Bye for now.
Happy New Year.